Today I'm going to be building 3 easy DIY Halloween projects for you to do at home. They start really simple and get a little bit more difficult as they go along, but they're all really easy, they're all perfect for beginners. Check it out. First up, we're going to be making something so easy that your kids can get involved with it as well. I'm sure they'll really enjoy it. We're going to be making a spooky gravestone. I'm going to be making this using some gnarly strips of pallet wood that I've got, but you can just as easily make it using some 1x6 boards or similar from your local hardware store. As you can see, mine has some shaping to it with some bark left on, which will be a great effect for the gravestone, which is why I'm using these boards. The first thing you'll need to do is decide how tall you want your gravestone to be, and then measure and mark it out on your boards. Once you've got the measurements marked out, you'll need to cut the boards to length. I'm going to be making mine out of 3 board widths, as this will look best based on the width of my boards. You can make yours accordingly based on the size and aesthetic you want. It's just a case of chopping them to length on the miter saw. If you don't have a miter saw, you can use a circular saw or even a jigsaw with a straight edge. The next step is to lay out your boards and draw your gravestone shape on the top. I just went with a standard curve, but you can be as creative as you want here. Once you're happy with the shape, cut it out using a jigsaw on the individual boards. Here's the final shape. I had this scrap left over from trimming them to size, and this will be perfect for the strips that will be joining the board together. So I set up my table saw and ran them through, so I had 3 strips. If you don't have a table saw, you can do this with your jigsaw, miter saw, or even a handsaw. They don't need to be overly neat, as they'll be hidden away at the back anyway. Once you've got your strips, flip over your gravestone and screw them across the boards. Make sure you put a screw in each board, as this will hold it all together. Depending on how thick your boards are and how you intend to display your gravestone, you may want to add a couple of triangles to help it stand up. I did this with a scrap of wood and just set my miter saw to 45 degrees and cut a square in half. Then I just applied glue and stuck them at the back at the bottom. Then I attached the 3rd strip and checked it all stood up okay. I've got some ebony stain left over from an old project, so I'm going to be using this. I picked it up from Amazon for about £15 and it's lasted ages. It goes on fairly light, so I'll be adding a few coats to get the desired effect. The alternative option would be to paint the entire thing with black or grey paint. Once I had the colour right, I taped out some outlines for letters and then painted them on with some white paint. It was then just a case of removing the tape and it was finished. Next up, we're going to be making a treat box for all the trick-or-treaters that come along. I'm using some plain down pine for this one. You can either plane some down yourself to give a flat face and edge, or you can buy PSE pine from any hardware store. I'd already drawn out the design for a spooky house on a hill on a piece of paper, so the first thing to do was to glue the design to my board. Once it was glued on, I trimmed off the excess on my miter saw. Again, you can do this with a circular saw, jigsaw, or even a handsaw. I then trimmed off any excess paper to make it easier to work with. Now, I've got a bandsaw, so I used this to cut out my design. You can do this with a scroll saw or a jigsaw too. Just remember that the type of saw you use may limit the complexity of your design. Once you've got your top shape cut out, you can start to make your box. I based my measurements off what I thought would look right against the house shape and what would hold a sufficient amount of sweets. I then cut my first piece based on my mark and used that piece to line up my board on the miter saw to cut the second piece so they match. I had to figure out the side pieces next, so just eyeballed the measurements again and figured out what I needed. It was then just a case of cutting the first piece to my mark and using that piece to reference my second piece in exactly the same way as I did on the front and back pieces. A quick run over with the sander meant I was ready for assembly. To assemble the box, I added a bead of glue along the front edge of the side pieces. Then place your front piece on the top and position it so it sits flush. I added a couple of brad nails to hold it in place and to allow me to keep moving with the project without having to wait for it all to dry fully. P.S. Don't waste your money on the Titan electric brad nailer, as it doesn't seat the nails properly, so you end up having to hammer each one in separately. Very annoying. Then just flip it over and add the back panel in exactly the same way. Next up, grab some of the timber you've not yet used and place it underneath your box. You can then line up a corner and scribe your internal measurements based on your finished box. I trimmed the end off on my miter saw and ran the long edge on my table saw. You can use the miter saw for both, or a handsaw could do the job too. Then just add a bead of glue around each edge of the base piece and fit it into place. Mine needed a bit of persuasion from the hammer, which meant it was a really nice fit. I added a couple of brad nails again, but you could just leave the glue to dry if you wanted. This next step is definitely optional, as you could paint your design straight onto your backdrop. But I decided to make mine a little more 3D by cutting out some shapes on a scrap of 6mm plywood. I drew my design on and then cut them on the bandsaw. A quick sand over the edges and then they were ready for paint. However, before painting anything, I gave the box a quick sand all round and paid attention to the edges and corners to make sure there were no sharp edges when little hands were reaching in for sweets. Next, I painted the plywood shapes with white paint and used CA glue with an activator to stick them to the house shape. Once they were on, I added the black stain. This is the same stain I used for the gravestone. I added it after the 3D elements because I wasn't sure how well the glue would stick to the stain. It probably would have been fine, but it wasn't difficult to paint around them. I did the same with the box, covering it both internally and externally with a few coats. Once it was all dry, I drilled some pocket holes into the back of the house shape at the base and used these to attach it to my box to finish the project. You could use dowels if you prefer, but this was quicker and easier. And it's going to be against a wall anyway, so it doesn't matter. The final project we're going to be making is a pumpkin lantern. For the pumpkin lantern, I selected some more palletwood boards as I've got loads to use up. As with the other projects, you can do this using standard PSE boards from your local hardware store. Because they were pallet boards, I ran them through the thicknesser and jointed one edge. You won't need to do this if you buy PSE boards. Then I added a good bead of glue to one edge and glued two boards together. I did this twice over so I'd end up with two wide boards. Depending on the measurements you want to make your lantern, you can adjust accordingly. Once the glue was dry, I scraped off any excess from the bottom and gave the boards a quick sand. Next up, I set my miter saw to 45° bevel and cut my first edge. Then I figured out how wide I wanted my lantern to be and set up a stop block at that distance from my blade. Then it was just a case of making all the other cuts until I had 4 pieces of equal size with beveled edges. You need to make sure that you remember to flip the board every time you make your cut so that you have a mirrored bevel on each piece. Now, I'm going to level with you here. I got so excited about my mitered box that I completely forgot this step I'm showing you now, but I recreated it so that you can follow along in the proper order. I missed this step and had to cut my design out of my assembled box, but you'll want to take this moment to draw out the face or design you want on your lantern on what will be your front facing piece, and then drill out pilot holes wherever you'll be making the cuts. I had 2 eyes and a mouth, so drilled 3 holes with a 10mm bit as it was big enough to get my jigsaw blade in. Then it's just a case of cutting along your lines to create your design. Next up, you'll want to line up all 4 of your pieces with mitered edges facing down but sitting side by side. You can see that I hadn't done my face at this stage, but it will show up further down the line. Add some tape along each miter and then carefully turn the entire thing over. You can then add glue along your joints and do the fun bit of closing the box up, which is really satisfying. I've got this band clamp and used it to further hold my box in position while I then peeled down the tape and added more strips of tape to each miter to pull it in tight and act as a clamp all the way along the edges. Once I'd added some tape, I removed the band clamp so I could add the rest of the tape. It's always a good idea to check for square at this stage. The easiest way to do this is to measure the diagonals. If the measurement from one diagonal matches the other diagonal, then you've got a nice square box. If it's slightly off, then you can just push on the longer edges to adjust until it's sitting square. Mine was looking good, so I added the band clamp back on to keep it there while I fired in a couple of brad nails so that I could continue working. You can just leave it overnight to dry if you aren't putting nails in. Just be sure to wipe off any excess glue with a damp cloth. Once it's all dry, you can take the tape off. Oh look, the face has magically appeared. How'd that get there? I added a bit of filler to mine as it was pallet wood, so I had some nail holes. You can skip this step if your wood doesn't have any holes. Then I measured out my base and top. I made these about 2 centimeters wider than the main box around all 4 edges and then cut it to size on the miter saw. I added some more of the black stain to both the top and bottom pieces. I didn't bother adding it to the underside of these pieces though, as you won't see it. Next up, I got some of this Valencia orange paint from B&Q. This tester pot was £2 and it was more than enough to do the entire box inside and outside with plenty left over. You could paint the inside black if you wanted, as it would reflect the light nicely, but I went with orange to keep it looking pumpkin-y. I decided it needed to be a bit more 3D on top, so I had this other scrap and cut it to a smaller square than the top piece and painted on a few coats of the black stain. To add the base, you'll want to turn your box upside down, line up the base until you're happy with it, and then pre-drill and screw in a few screws to hold it together. My son came in dressed very appropriately for a Halloween project, so I thought I'd ask him what he thought. What do you think of this? I think that's the right reaction. To add the 3D elements to the top, just place it on and turn everything upside down so you can drive a few screws in. Just make sure they aren't too close to the edges, as you could risk splitting the wood. I wanted to make sure the top sits on neatly without sliding around, so I took another offcut and scribed a measurement for the internal space. Then I cut it on the miter saw and checked it fit. Then I cut off 4 strips at my table saw. I then drew around the outside of the box onto my top so I could see where it would sit. I drew a line inside that line with a scrap of the same wood as the box, which gave me my internal measurements, and then used CA glue with some activator to stick the strips in place. Once the front and back strips were in place, I scribed a mark for my side strips and cut them down to final size on the miter saw. Then I glued them in place as well. The top fits great, not too tight but stops it sliding off. I wanted to add one more thing to it, so I got this thick piece of scrap wood and cut a rectangle onto the miter saw. Then I set it to 30 degrees and cut a diagonal line across the top, and then back to a straight cut to trim it down to size. A quick sand of the rough edges and I could drill a pilot hole in the top where I wanted it to go. I then used this hole to add a small indentation onto the stalk piece and then continued my pilot hole into it. Then I added a screw, tightened it up, and added a last bit of black stain to finish it off. Make sure you use electric candles in this, as there's a fire risk with any naked flames in wooden boxes.
And there you have it. 3 really easy DIY Halloween projects for you to do at home. If you enjoyed this video and you want to do more DIY projects in the future, you're going to want to watch this video next. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.